It is the very end of December 1460. The air is cold and heavy with the smell of iron and snow. High on Micklegate Bar, one of the main gates into the English city of York, a head has been impaled on a spike for all to see. This is not the head of a common criminal. It belongs to Richard, the powerful Duke of York, a man who, just weeks before, had a claim on the throne of England itself. And to complete the humiliation, his enemies have placed a flimsy paper crown upon his head, a final, mocking insult. This gruesome display serves as a brutal introduction to the conflict we are exploring today, the Wars of the Roses. What could possibly drive a kingdom to this point of savagery? This was a bitter, personal and bloody dynastic struggle that pitted cousin against cousin, tearing the ruling class of England apart. To understand how it came to this, we need to go back to the England of the mid-15th century. The nation was in a state of crisis. The glorious victories of King Henry V at battles like Agincourt were now just a distant, fading memory. England had been shamefully and decisively defeated in the long-running 100 Years' War, driven out of its territories in France. This defeat left a deep scar on the national psyche. It also created a severe practical problem. Thousands of unemployed soldiers and their powerful, disgruntled lords returned to England, bringing their military skills and their grievances with them. The entire country became a powder keg of armed and restless men, loyal to the local noblemen who paid their wages. At the heart of this volatile kingdom was a power vacuum. The conflict boiled down to two competing branches of the same royal family, the Plantagenets. On one side was the reigning house of Lancaster, whose symbol was the red rose. Their king was Henry VI, a man known more for his piety and gentle nature than for his ability to rule. Prone to long periods of complete mental breakdown, Henry was a weak and ineffectual leader, creating a void that ambitious men were all too willing to fill. On the other side was the challenger, the House of York, represented by the White Rose. Their leader was the capable and incredibly wealthy Richard, Duke of York, the man whose head now decorated the gates of the city that shared his name. And Richard of York had a secret weapon, a claim to the throne that was, by some arguments, even stronger than the king's. This podcast is the story of a fight for the ultimate prize, the crown of England. It is a conflict fueled by raw ambition, the shaky foundations of the Lancastrian dynasty, breathtaking political incompetence, and the fierce, formidable personalities who would stop at nothing to win. Men and women like the unyielding Queen Margaret of Anjou, who fought tooth and nail for her husband and son, and the powerful Earl of Warwick, a man so influential he would become known to history as the Kingmaker. Over the course of this episode, we will trace the deep roots of this war, going back to a stolen crown in 1399. We will follow the brutal back and forth of the major battles, witness the rise and fall of kings, and uncover the betrayals and alliances that shaped a generation. And finally, we will arrive at the dramatic conclusion of the conflict, a single battle that ended a dynasty and gave birth to a new one that would change England forever, the Tudors. To truly understand the Wars of the Roses, we have to rewind the clock more than half a century before the first sword was drawn. The root of the conflict lies in a single, pivotal act, the theft of a crown. The year is 1399. The king is Richard II. He is deposed by his own cousin, Henry Bolingbroke. Bolingbroke forces Richard to abdicate and takes the throne for himself, becoming King Henry IV. This act was the original sin of the House of Lancaster. Henry IV's claim to the throne was questionable. He was the son of John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster, who was the third surviving son of the great King Edward III. By taking the crown through force, he bypassed the established laws of succession. This created a fatal flaw, a time bomb ticking at the heart of the Lancastrian dynasty. Why? Because there was another family with a better claim, a claim that came not through the third son, but through the second son of Edward III, a man named Lionel, Duke of Clarence. By the strict laws of primogeniture, where the crown passes down the line of the eldest sons, Lionel's descendants had a superior right to the throne. For decades, this fact lay dormant, but through a series of strategic marriages, this superior claim eventually passed to one man, Richard, Duke of York. He was now the heir of the second son, while the ruling Lancastrians were heirs of the third. For years, this was just a technicality, a dangerous piece of information whispered in private. But in the right circumstances, it could become a justification for rebellion, a reason to plunge the entire kingdom into war. Those circumstances arrived during the reign of Henry IV's grandson, King Henry VI. To say that Henry VI was a poor king would be an understatement. He was the complete opposite of his father, the legendary Henry V, the heroic victor of the Battle of Agincourt. Where his father was a charismatic and ruthless warrior king, Henry VI was gentle, deeply religious, and bookish. He was a good man, but a terrible medieval monarch. He lacked the political skill, the decisiveness, and the sheer force of will required to control his powerful and ambitious noblemen. His reign was a disaster. Under his weak leadership, the gains made by his father in the 100 Years' War were squandered. One by one, English territories in France were lost. The final fall of Normandy and Gascony was a profound national humiliation. The nobles who had spent fortunes and shed blood fighting in France were furious. They, and the public, laid the blame squarely on the king's incompetent advisers, chief among them the Duke of Somerset. With the king unable to effectively lead, power was held by a collection of competing factions at court. And the leader of the dominant faction was the king's wife, Queen Margaret of Anjou. Margaret was everything her husband was not. She was a French princess, proud, intelligent, and fiercely protective of her husband's crown and, more importantly, her son's right to inherit it. She saw her husband's weakness and stepped into the political void. She forged powerful alliances, dispensed patronage, and made it clear that she and her favorite, the Duke of Somerset, were in charge. Anyone who opposed them was seen as an enemy of the crown itself. This created a deep and bitter rivalry with the most powerful nobleman in the entire kingdom, Richard, Duke of York. Initially, York did not publicly claim the throne. His stated goal was simply to reform the corrupt and failing government. He saw the incompetence of Somerset and his allies, who were losing the war in France and mismanaging the royal finances, and he believed he could do a better job. York was a competent administrator and a respected soldier. He had a huge network of loyal followers and was popular with the common people who were tired of the failed regime. But Margaret and Somerset saw York's power, his popularity, and his superior bloodline as a direct threat. They systematically worked to exclude him from the king's council, sideline him in government, and deny him positions of influence. They saw him as a rival to be contained, but in doing so, they turned a potential ally into a determined enemy. The political standoff reached a breaking point in August of 1453. The final humiliating news of the end of the 100 Years' War reached King Henry. The shock of this ultimate defeat was apparently too much for his fragile mind. The king suffered a complete mental and physical collapse. He sat in his chair, staring blankly, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to even recognize his own newborn son. He was, for all intents and purposes, a living statue. The kingdom was now officially leaderless. With the king completely incapacitated, Parliament had to act. They had little choice but to appoint the most powerful and respected man in the realm to govern. In March 1454, Richard, Duke of York, was named Lord Protector of England. He finally had the power he craved. He governed effectively, tackling corruption, attempting to restore the treasury, and most significantly, he had his great rival, the Duke of Somerset, arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London. For over a year, York ruled England in the king's name. It seemed his faction had won a bloodless victory. But then, on Christmas Day of 1454, the unthinkable happened. King Henry VI woke up. Just as suddenly as it had started, his catatonic state ended. He was lucid once more. And the first person to gain his ear was his wife, Queen Margaret. Under her direction, everything York had achieved was immediately undone. His appointments were cancelled, his policies were reversed, and his great enemy, the Duke of Somerset, was released from the Tower and restored to his position as the king's chief advisor. For Richard of York, this was a disaster. He was once again shut out of power. Worse still, he was now in mortal danger. With Somerset back in control, it was only a matter of time before York and his allies would be accused of treason for their actions during the Protectorate. He was faced with a stark choice: submit and face political ruin and likely execution, or fight back. He chose to fight. He summoned his retainers and his most important allies. These were the powerful Neville family, led by the Earl of Salisbury and his charismatic and ambitious son, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, a man who would one day be known as the Kingmaker. On the 22nd of May, 1455, York's army marched south and met the king's Lancastrian forces in the town of St. Albans. What followed was less of a full-scale battle and more of a targeted, violent brawl through the narrow streets. The Yorkists' goals were simple: kill their enemies and capture the king. In the chaos of the fighting, the Duke of Somerset was cornered and hacked to death. A handful of other key Lancastrian nobles were also killed. King Henry VI himself was found hiding in a tanner's shop, having been grazed in the neck by an arrow. The Yorkists captured their king, reaffirmed their loyalty to him, and escorted him back to London. The first blood had now been drawn. This was the point of no return. The deaths at St. Albans started a series of vicious blood feuds that would poison the English nobility for a generation. The sons of the men killed that day would grow up seeking vengeance against the Yorkists, and Queen Margaret of Anjou would never forgive Richard of York for the death of her closest ally and the humiliation of her husband. They attempted to patch things up. In 1458, the major figures from both sides took part in a Love Day procession, a public ceremony of reconciliation where they walked hand in hand to St. Paul's Cathedral. But it was a hollow gesture. Behind the smiles, both factions were quietly stockpiling weapons and gathering armies. The uneasy peace was not going to last. The skirmish at St. Albans was over, but the war had just begun. The fragile peace that followed the First Battle of St. Albans was doomed from the start. Queen Margaret of Anjou, now the undisputed leader of the Lancastrian cause, refused to accept a government led by the man who had killed her allies. She established a rival court in the Midlands and began raising a formidable army, distributing her emblem of the silver swan to loyal lords. The kingdom was splitting in two. In 1459, the Lancastrians held a parliament which became known as the Parliament of Devils. In it, they passed an Act of Attainder against the leading Yorkists, declaring Richard of York, Warwick, and their key supporters to be traitors. Their lands were forfeited, their titles were stripped, and they were sentenced to death. This act left the Yorkists with no room for negotiation. Their only option now was to fight for their very lives. The conflict escalated into open warfare. After a series of battles and maneuvers, the Yorkists, led by the ever-capable Earl of Warwick, once again gained the upper hand, capturing King Henry VI at the Battle of Northampton in 1460. With the king in their custody, Richard of York returned from exile in Ireland and marched into London. He strode into Parliament, walked to the empty throne, and placed his hand upon it, formally laying claim to the crown of England. The move shocked everyone. Even his closest allies had thought his goal was to reform the government, not to depose the king. After days of tense debate, a compromise was reached, known as the Act of Accord. Henry VI would remain king for the rest of his life. But upon his death, the crown would not pass to his own son, Prince Edward, but to Richard of York and his heirs. For Queen Margaret, this was an act of war against her own child. The Act of Accord had disinherited her son, and she would not stand for it. She raised a huge Lancastrian army in the north, an army that was furious at the insult to the king and his rightful heir. Richard of York, now the official heir to the throne, foolishly underestimated her determination. He marched north with a much smaller force to deal with the threat. In late December of 1460, he took up residence at Sandal Castle, near Wakefield. The Lancastrian forces surrounded him. Against the advice of his senior commanders, on the 30th of December, Richard led his army out of the safety of the castle and onto the open field. It was a catastrophic mistake. He was lured into a trap, and his army was utterly annihilated at the Battle of Wakefield. The outcome was a brutal and personal disaster for the House of York. Richard himself was slain in the fighting. His 17-year-old second son, Edmund, Earl of Rutland, was captured as he tried to flee and was mercilessly executed by a Lancastrian lord in revenge for his own father's death at St. Albans. The revenge was not yet complete. Margaret ordered Richard's head to be cut off and impaled over the gates of York. And in a final, vicious gesture of contempt, she had a paper crown placed upon it. The Yorkist cause seemed to have died with its leader, its bloody end marked by a crown of paper. But the Lancastrians had not accounted for Richard of York's eldest son, Edward, the new Duke of York. And Edward was not like his father. He was just 18 years old, but he was a giant of a man, standing at 6 feet 4 inches tall. He was handsome, charismatic, and possessed a natural genius for military command. He was everything the frail King Henry VI was not. When Edward learned of the murder of his father and brother, he was not broken. He was filled with a burning desire for vengeance. In February of 1461, he intercepted a Lancastrian army marching from Wales at a place called Mortimer's Cross. Just before the battle, a strange atmospheric phenomenon occurred. 3 suns appeared in the winter sky. While his men were terrified by this omen, Edward declared it a sign of the Holy Trinity, proof that God was on their side. He inspired his troops, crushed the Lancastrian force, and adopted the sun in splendor as his personal emblem. A new Yorkist sun was rising. While Edward was victorious in the west, his cousin Warwick was being defeated in the east. At the Second Battle of St. Albans, Margaret's army surprised Warwick's forces, defeated them, and recaptured the ultimate prize, the helpless King Henry VI. With the king in her possession, Margaret's army now marched towards London. But the city was terrified. Her northern army had a fearsome reputation for looting and pillaging, and London's citizens locked the gates against them. This hesitation proved fatal for the Lancastrian cause. Edward, marching with incredible speed from his victory at Mortimer's Cross, joined forces with Warwick and reached London first. The capital enthusiastically opened its gates to the handsome and heroic young duke. Seeing his chance, Edward seized the political moment. On March 4, 1461, he was acclaimed King Edward IV in Westminster Abbey. England now had two kings. A final, decisive battle was inevitable, and that battle came on Palm Sunday, the 29th of March, 1461, near the village of Towton in Yorkshire. What followed was the largest, longest, and bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. An estimated 75,000 men took part, nearly 10% of the country's entire military-aged population. They fought for hours in a blinding snowstorm, the wind blowing the snow into the faces of the Lancastrians. The fighting was a merciless, brutal affair, with men hacking at each other in the mud and the snow. Edward IV, a natural leader, fought in the front ranks, inspiring his men with his courage and sheer physical presence. The battle ended in a total rout of the Lancastrian army. Thousands were killed in the fighting, and thousands more were slaughtered as they fled, their retreat cut off by a river that was said to run red with blood. The military power of the House of Lancaster was utterly crushed at Towton. Queen Margaret, her son, and the deposed Henry VI fled into exile. Edward IV, barely 19 years old, had secured his throne with a truly unprecedented tide of blood. For nearly a decade, Edward IV ruled a kingdom that was largely at peace. His throne was secure, and his most powerful supporter was the man who had helped put him there, his cousin, the Earl of Warwick. Warwick was so rich, so influential, and so powerful that he was known as the Kingmaker. But King Edward made a catastrophic political mistake that would turn his greatest ally into his most dangerous enemy. While Warwick was in France, attempting to negotiate a prestigious and politically useful marriage between Edward and a French princess, the king fell in love. He secretly married a beautiful English widow from a minor noble family named Elizabeth Woodville. For Warwick, this was a public humiliation and a political disaster. The secret marriage wrecked his diplomatic negotiations. Worse, the new queen had a large and incredibly ambitious family. The Woodvilles were soon showered with lands, titles, and lucrative marriages, displacing Warwick's own Neville family from their position at the very heart of royal power and patronage. The Kingmaker, the man who had put Edward on the throne, now found himself being pushed aside by the Queen's upstart relatives. He was infuriated. Feeling disrespected and marginalized, Warwick decided that if he could make a king, he could unmake one too. He began to conspire with Edward's own younger brother, the unstable and perpetually jealous George, Duke of Clarence. In 1469, they launched a rebellion, defeated a royal army, and even managed to capture King Edward himself. But Warwick found that ruling the country without the king was impossible, and he was eventually forced to release him. After a second, failed rebellion, Warwick and Clarence were declared traitors and forced to flee to France. There, in the court of the French king, Warwick did the unthinkable. He made an alliance with the person he had spent his entire adult life fighting against, the exiled Lancastrian queen, Margaret of Anjou. The two bitter enemies were united by a single, overwhelming emotion, their shared hatred for King Edward IV. To seal the pact, Warwick's own daughter, Anne Neville, was betrothed to Margaret's son, the Lancastrian Prince of Wales. In September of 1470, Warwick the Kingmaker, now fighting under the banner of the Red Rose of Lancaster, invaded England. King Edward was caught completely by surprise. The country turned against him, and he was forced to flee into exile in Burgundy with his youngest brother, Richard of Gloucester. Warwick marched into London, went to the Tower, and retrieved a bewildered and frail Henry VI. This extraordinary reversal of fortune became known as the re-adeption. After 9 years of Yorkist rule, a Lancastrian king was once more on the throne of England. Warwick may have been the Kingmaker, but he had made a fatal error. He had underestimated the man he had once made king. In March of 1471, less than 6 months after being driven from his kingdom, Edward IV returned. He landed at Ravenspur in Yorkshire with only a small force funded by his Burgundian allies. It was a huge gamble. He cleverly and dishonestly claimed at first that he had only come to reclaim his rightful title as Duke of York, not the crown. This tactic lowered resistance, and as he marched south, he gathered support. The pivotal moment came when his treacherous brother, George, Duke of Clarence, realized his future was bleak under a restored Lancastrian regime controlled by Warwick and Margaret. In a dramatic reconciliation, Clarence betrayed his new allies and rejoined his brother Edward with all his troops. The Yorkist cause was reborn. What followed was one of the most remarkable military campaigns in English history, all decided in the year 1471. First came the Battle of Barnet. On the 14th of April, in the dense, disorienting fog of an early morning, Edward's army clashed with Warwick's forces just north of London. The battle was a confused and brutal mess. In a fatal moment of chaos, a group of Lancastrian soldiers led by the Earl of Oxford, whose emblem was a star with streams, was mistakenly identified as the Yorkist emblem of a sun with streams. Their own allies, thinking they were being attacked from the rear, fired upon them. Cries of treason broke out, and the Lancastrian line collapsed. In the defeat that followed, the mighty Warwick the Kingmaker was cut down and killed as he tried to escape through the woods. Edward gave his army no time to rest. He had won a great victory, but the war was not over. Queen Margaret of Anjou and her 17-year-old son, the Lancastrian heir Prince Edward, had finally landed in England on the very day of the battle. Edward IV's force marched his exhausted army west at incredible speed to intercept them before they could reach their Welsh allies. On the 4th of May, he caught them at Tewkesbury. The battle that followed was another stunning Yorkist victory. Edward's military genius was on full display as he shattered the Lancastrian army. In the battle, or in its bloody aftermath, the hope of the House of Lancaster, Prince Edward of Wales, was killed. He was the only son of Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou. With the death of the Lancastrian prince, the war was essentially over. Queen Margaret was captured a few days later. On the 21st of May, 1471, Edward IV made his triumphant return to London. The Lancastrian cause was now completely broken, its heir dead, its queen a prisoner. But one final piece of business remained. On the very night that Edward entered the capital, the man who had started it all, the gentle and tragic Henry VI, was murdered in his cell in the Tower of London. With the death of Henry and the killing of his son, the direct male line of the House of Lancaster, which had ruled England for over 70 years, was extinguished forever. The next 12 years, from 1471 to 1483, marked the golden afternoon of the House of York. With his enemies dead or in exile, Edward IV ruled as a strong, decisive, and popular king. He restored law and order to the kingdom, stabilized the nation's finances through savvy business deals, and was a great patron of arts and architecture. He even supported the new and revolutionary technology of the printing press, introduced by William Caxton. It seemed the Wars of the Roses were finally over. But there was one last family problem to deal with. His brother, George, Duke of Clarence, remained a constant source of instability. After years of further scheming and treasonous plots, King Edward's patience finally ran out. In 1478, Clarence was arrested, put on trial for treason before Parliament, and found guilty. He was executed privately in the Tower of London. According to a famous and persistent legend, the manner of his death was unique. He was drowned in a large barrel of his favorite Malmsey wine. In April of 1483, the peace was suddenly shattered. King Edward IV, still a powerful figure at just 40 years of age, fell ill after a fishing trip and died unexpectedly. The kingdom was thrown into turmoil. The new king was his son, Edward V, a boy of only 12 years old. In his will, the late king had named his most loyal and trusted supporter as Lord Protector of his son and the realm, his youngest brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Richard had served his brother faithfully for years, ruling the often unruly north of England with skill and justice. His personal emblem was the white boar. As Lord Protector, Richard's first duty was to bring the new young king safely to London for his coronation. But he immediately found himself in a power struggle with the Queen's family, the Woodvilles, whom he deeply distrusted. Believing the Woodvilles were planning to sideline him and rule through the boy king, Richard acted with lightning speed. He intercepted the young Edward V on his journey to the capital, arrested his Woodville guardians, and escorted the boy to London himself. The young king was lodged in the Tower of London, which was then a royal residence as well as a prison, to await his coronation. Shortly after, Richard persuaded the Queen to allow the king's younger brother, also named Richard, to join him in the Tower, claiming the young king was lonely. Now he had both of Edward's sons in his custody. Then came the public bombshell. A priest preached a sermon at St. Paul's Cross, declaring that King Edward IV had been secretly engaged to another woman before he married Elizabeth Woodville. According to church law at the time, this prior contract meant his marriage to the Queen was invalid. And if the marriage was invalid, all of their children, including the two boys in the Tower, were illegitimate. With King Edward IV's children declared bastards, Parliament passed an act known as Titulus Regius, which stated that the true heir to the throne was the late king's youngest brother. In July of 1483, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was crowned King Richard III, and the two young princes he had sworn to protect. They were seen at the windows of the Tower for a few weeks, their appearances growing rarer and rarer, until one day they were not seen at all. They vanished from sight, creating one of the most compelling and sinister mysteries in all of English history. Richard III was a skilled administrator and a proven soldier, yet his reign was built on a foundation of sand. From the moment he took the throne in July of 1483, he was haunted by the shadow of his accession and the sinister disappearance of his own nephews. The widespread and persistent belief that he had murdered the young princes in the Tower poisoned his reign, costing him crucial support among the nobility, even those who had previously been loyal to the House of York. His crown rested uneasily on his head. Richard tried to project an image of stability and justice. He embarked on a grand royal progress through his kingdom, dispensing justice and patronage, hoping to win the hearts of his subjects and solidify his authority. He called a parliament in 1484 which enacted significant legal reforms, including protections for defendants in property cases and a system of bail for accused felons, measures designed to show him as a protector of the common man. But these efforts, however well-intentioned, could not erase the central, damning question: where were the boys? The official story was that they were illegitimate, but that did not mean they were not a threat. As long as they lived, they remained a potential focus for rebellion for anyone who wished to challenge Richard's rule. From the moment they vanished from public view within the stone walls of the Tower of London, the whispers began. An Italian visitor to London, Dominic Mancini, wrote that the boys were moved into the inner apartments of the Tower, and that after a while the young King Edward was seen less and less, weeping and stating that he wished to die. Then they were seen no more. The belief that Richard had ordered their murder spread like wildfire, both at home and in the courts of Europe. It was a political catastrophe from which his reign would never recover. The loyalty he commanded was that of a successful general and administrator, but he had lost the moral authority to be a king. The first great challenge to his rule came from a man who had been his greatest supporter, his right-hand man in the seizure of the throne, Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham. Buckingham had been showered with land and titles by the new king, yet just 3 months into the reign, he became the leader of a massive rebellion aimed at deposing Richard. His motives remain a subject of intense debate. Did he have a crisis of conscience over the murder of the princes? Or was he a cynical opportunist with a distant claim to the throne himself, who simply saw a chance to take the crown in the chaos? Whatever the reason, Buckingham orchestrated a widespread revolt, coordinating with a network of discontented gentry in the south of England and, crucially, with the last remaining Lancastrian claimant across the sea in Brittany. But the rebellion was a disaster. A massive storm in the English Channel prevented Henry Tudor from landing his forces, and torrential rains and floods in England stopped Buckingham from moving his army. His revolt fizzled out, his men deserted him, and Buckingham himself was captured and summarily executed for treason in November of 1483. Richard had survived the first test, but the rebellion revealed just how fragile his support really was. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, the alternative to Richard's rule was slowly gathering strength. His name was Henry Tudor, the Earl of Richmond. On paper, Henry's claim to the throne was incredibly weak. It came through his mother, the formidable and pious Margaret Beaufort, who was a great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt, the patriarch of the House of Lancaster. But this lineage came from a line that had been born illegitimate, and, although later legitimised by an Act of Parliament, had been specifically and publicly barred from ever inheriting the throne. Henry, however, had spent almost his entire adult life, 14 years, as a political exile in the Duchy of Brittany, far from the bloody chaos of English politics. This obscurity turned out to be his greatest strength. He was a blank slate, the last man standing with any meaningful link to the Lancastrian cause. He became the focus for all of the discontented, exiled, and terrified opponents of King Richard III. A brilliant political alliance was forged by two powerful women working in secret. Henry's mother, Margaret Beaufort, began a secret correspondence with the former Yorkist queen, Elizabeth Woodville, the mother of the missing princes. The two women, whose families had been bitter enemies for decades, came to a shocking agreement. They would unite their causes. Henry Tudor would swear an oath to marry Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's eldest daughter. This was a masterstroke of political genius. The marriage would physically and symbolically unite the houses of Lancaster and York. It promised to bring all of Richard's enemies, both Lancastrian and Yorkist, under a single banner. It offered the tantalizing prospect of an end to the decades of civil war. While this new coalition grew in strength, Richard's position weakened further. In April of 1484, his world was shattered by a personal tragedy. His only legitimate son and heir, 10-year-old Edward of Middleham, died suddenly. The loss was devastating for Richard and his wife, Queen Anne Neville. It was also a dynastic catastrophe. The House of York now had no clear heir. Many saw the boy's death as divine punishment for the presumed murder of the princes. Less than a year later, in March of 1485, Queen Anne herself died of tuberculosis, fueling yet more dark and unfounded rumours that Richard had poisoned her in order to marry his own niece, Elizabeth of York, to secure his throne. With his wife and son dead, and his reputation in tatters, Richard became an increasingly isolated and beleaguered figure. Seeing his opportunity, Henry Tudor made his move. On the 1st of August, 1485, backed by French money and a small army of mercenaries and English exiles, he sailed for Wales. He landed at Mill Bay in Pembrokeshire, a calculated choice to capitalise on his Welsh heritage and avoid Richard's main forces. He marched inland, gathering supporters as he went, flying the standard of the Red Dragon of Cadwallader, a potent symbol of Welsh pride. King Richard, an experienced commander who had been anticipating an invasion for months, moved quickly to intercept this threat. The two armies marched towards a final, decisive confrontation. They met on the 22nd of August, near a small market town in Leicestershire called Market Bosworth. Richard's army was larger and more experienced, taking up a strong defensive position on a ridge known as Ambion Hill. But the fate of the battle, and of England itself, would ultimately be decided by a powerful northern family, the Stanleys, who had a foot in both camps. Lord Thomas Stanley was Henry Tudor's stepfather, but Richard, suspecting his loyalty, had taken Lord Stanley's son, George, hostage. Richard sent a message to Stanley demanding he join the royal army at once, or his son would be executed. Stanley's chilling reply was that he had other sons. With thousands of men under their command, the Stanley brothers positioned their forces on a hill overlooking the battlefield and waited, a neutral Third Army, ready to join whichever side looked most likely to win. The battle began with a punishing artillery barrage from Richard's cannons. The main bodies of the armies then clashed. The fighting was fierce, particularly between the vanguard of Richard's army, led by the veteran Duke of Norfolk, and Henry's forces, led by the experienced Earl of Oxford. As the brutal melee raged, Richard saw Henry Tudor's banner across the field, protected by only a small group of bodyguards, separated from his main force. In that moment, Richard, a true Plantagenet warrior, made a fateful and desperate decision. He would end the war himself with a single devastating cavalry charge. He gathered his household knights, lowered his lance, and thundered across the field, aiming directly for Henry Tudor. For a terrifying moment, it seemed the gamble might pay off. Richard's charge hit Henry's retinue with incredible force. The king fought like a demon, personally cutting down Henry's giant standard-bearer, Sir William Brandon, and unhorsing another renowned champion, Sir John Cheyne. He came within a sword's length of Henry Tudor himself, a man with little to no battlefield experience. But at that exact critical moment, Sir William Stanley made his choice. The Stanley forces, which had waited on the sidelines for the entire battle, finally charged down the hill. They did not attack Henry Tudor. They crashed into the flank of King Richard's small, exhausted retinue. Richard's charge stalled. He was surrounded, his men cut down around him. He was offered a horse to escape, but he refused, shouting, "Treason! Treason! I will not retreat 1 foot! I will die the King of England, or I will win the day!" Knocked from his horse, the last Plantagenet king was swarmed and hacked to death. On the battlefield itself, Henry Tudor had Richard's fallen circlet, retrieved from a hawthorn bush, placed upon his head. He was now King Henry VII. Richard's body was stripped naked, slung ignominiously over the back of a horse, and taken to Leicester, where it was put on public display to prove that the king was truly dead. To secure a lasting peace and legitimize his reign, Henry kept his promise. In January of 1486, he married Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of King Edward IV. This marriage finally united the warring houses. The new emblem of the royal house would be a fusion of the two symbols that had caused so much bloodshed, the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York, combined to form the Tudor rose. This powerful piece of propaganda signified a new beginning, a final end to the Cousins' War. The Wars of the Roses had torn the English nobility to shreds, ushered in an age of unimaginable violence and instability, and brought about the fall of a great and ancient dynasty. But from its fire and blood, a new, stronger and more modern English state was forged, ruled by a powerful and cunning line of monarchs who would change the nation forever: the Tudors. And so we end on a muddy field in Leicestershire. The death of Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field was more than just the death of a man, or even of a king. It was the violent, bloody end of an entire royal dynasty. The Plantagenets, who had ruled England for over 300 years and produced some of its most legendary kings, were gone, their final monarch slain in the heat of battle. The brutal conflict that began in the streets of St. Albans with a targeted assassination that saw a duke's head mocked with a paper crown had finally come full circle, ending with the crown of England being plucked from a hawthorn bush and placed on a new head. The victor, Henry Tudor, was now King Henry VII. He understood better than anyone that winning a battle did not win the peace. His claim to the throne was fragile, and the kingdom was exhausted and deeply scarred by 30 years of intermittent, brutal civil war. To heal the nation's wounds, he made a promise and he kept it. His marriage to Elizabeth of York, the daughter of the Yorkist King Edward IV, was a masterstroke of political reconciliation. It was an act that promised to end the generational blood feuds. Out of this union, a powerful new symbol was born: the Tudor rose, a clever piece of political branding that fused the white rose of the House of York with the red rose of the House of Lancaster. It was a visual declaration to all of England that the division was over. A new age, under a new dynasty, had begun. The consequences of the Wars of the Roses were profound. The conflict had been a catastrophe for the old English aristocracy. Many of the great noble houses of the medieval period were wiped out entirely, their lands and titles reverting to the crown. This systematic destruction of the old power structure created a vacuum that the new, calculating Tudor monarchy was all too willing to fill. Henry VII and his successors would build a stronger, more centralized state, less reliant on the whims of overmighty nobles. The ghosts of the conflict did not vanish immediately, of course. Henry's early reign was plagued by Yorkist plots and pretenders to the throne, men like Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck who tried to reignite the flames of the war. But these were the last dying embers of a fire that had finally burned itself out. Ultimately, the Wars of the Roses served as a bloody and chaotic crucible for the English nation. The conflict burned away the last vestiges of the medieval world and forged a new, more modern state. The memory of the weakness and anarchy of King Henry VI's reign would haunt English politics for the next century. It directly informed the strong, often tyrannical rule of Henry VII's famous successors, King Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth I. Their relentless drive for security, for a clear succession, and for absolute royal authority was a direct response to the horrors of the preceding generation. The brutal family feud for the crown was over, but its long shadow would define the powerful and transformative age that followed. This podcast was entirely produced by Andrew Scott. If you have any suggestions for topics or improvements, please get in contact